to promote our new collective work, a new SHIO paper that was published last week under the title Low Trust, Navigating Transatlantic Relations Under Trump 2.0. This is a whole of institute effort that analyzes the deep changes in the relationship between the US, Europe, and the world that have occurred in the year 2025. And I'm Giuseppe Spatafora. I'm one of the editors of the SHIO paper. I've also contributed with the introduction and conclusion chapters. And I'm joined here by 4 other contributors to the report, and I'm just going to introduce them in alphabetical order. We have with us Leonardo De Agostini, who is a project officer at the EU-founded project on countering foreign interference. We have Luigi Scazzieri, who is our senior policy analyst on common security and defense policy, and Katarina Sidlo, who is the senior analyst for the Middle East and North Africa, and Bojana Zoric, who is the policy analyst for the Western Balkans and the Eastern neighborhood. So you see, we have an array of expertise in the room today, in the virtual room. And together we will try to give you a glimpse into the report, its main findings and its recommendations. We also plan on answering any questions you may have. We'll try to make it as interactive as possible. So do pose your questions. You can use the LinkedIn page to send a message, and we will do our best to tackle all of them towards the end of the event. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll start with a couple of introductory remarks, and then I'll give the floor to my colleagues. So the main argument of this SHIO paper is that the transatlantic relationship has fundamentally changed in the year 2025. There have been periods of tensions and episodes before, of course, but the year 2025 to us seems to mark a fundamental shift. This new administration, the Trump 2.0 administration, seems to have shaken some of the foundations that underpinned trust in the transatlantic relationship. For example, the administration now seems to operate with uncertainty as one of its main methods. And we've seen that in trade, with the difficulties in reaching a trade agreement between the EU and the US, but also in defense and in support to Ukraine, where, again, there's been ebbs and flows. We've also seen that this administration has sometimes displayed hostility to Europe, not always, but there have been areas such as the Europe's attempts to curb disinformation that have been attacked by the administration. And there are other examples, such as siding with Russia at the UN General Assembly, voting on Ukraine. And as a third point, the US policy-making apparatus seems to have changed. The policy process is much more centralized. It seems to reward loyalty to the president above all, and it makes it difficult for Europeans to influence the process. In fact, the best way that European leaders have to influence the process is to go directly to the president with hastily arranged meetings, such as the one in the White House in August, right after the Trump summit with Putin. And once again, now there are discussions whether something else similar should be in the making. Now, obviously, this degree of low trust varies a lot across area. And there are some areas in which a way forward could be found, but low trust is sort of impinging on cooperation. And there are other areas in which EU and US interests are more clearly at odds, such as the issue of regulating big tech. And in fact, we have 6 chapters in the report that cover many of these issues. And we have 2 examples here with us. But we also have another area in which we look at the rest of the world. We look at the way in which other regions are dealing with Trump 2. From regions that have been directly on the front line of the attacks, such as American countries, but also regions that have been sort of neglected. And others that have, how we can say, they've seen it coming. They have prepared in the past, and of course there is uncertainty now, but they're preparing the way for dealing with this new administration in ways that perhaps Europe cannot. So we need to think what Europe can offer these other current parts of the world and where it can learn from them. Now, there are a lot of ideas in this paper about how to deal with the transatlantic relationship. We have suggested 5 Ps for action. Some are technical and sort of in the short term. They're about pragmatism and persistence in talking with Trump and keeping ties with the US. But you also look at the long run. We think about preparing for future shocks. We suggest developing European power, the ability to act if necessary without the US. And we, as I mentioned before, talk about partnerships, making sure that Europe doesn't end up mistakenly assuming that we are alone. There are other regions of the world that are suffering the same as Europe. They're trying to navigate Trump 2.0, and it is best to do it together rather than separately. Now, this is just to give you an idea of the entire project, and I now want to turn to my co-authors. Each of them will talk briefly about their chapter, what they wrote in the Chaillot paper, and of course, they're more than welcome to tie to even more recent events that have happened. In briefly, they will talk about what has changed in their area of interest since the start of Trump 2.0, why that matters, what are the strategic implications for Europe, and third, what are the suggestions for the EU? How can it move forward in an age of low trust in this specific area? And now I will start with one of the core areas that we always discuss, which is defense, security and defense, and specifically the fact that Europe may be in a situation which it still wants the US on its side, but it may be preparing for different times ahead. And for that, I will pass the floor to Luigi.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here. So the starting point really of my chapter is that with Trump 2, Europeans have, for the first time, genuine doubts about America's commitment to European security. They have these doubts for several reasons. On one hand, because US officials openly say, and US documents openly say, that Europe is no longer a priority. And the US priorities are, on the other hand, China and the homeland. There are also the mixed messages that the US is sending on its commitment to NATO. Indeed, there was a change of rhetoric after the summit in The Hague this summer, a more positive mood, and optimists may say that there has not yet been a significant shift or sweeping cuts in the US presence in Europe. But there remains a degree of ambiguity, both at the rhetorical level and also in terms of practical steps. For example, with the cuts in the announced cuts in US funding to the Baltic states. And as you set out in your introduction, all this is happening in the context of a rather strained US-European relationship. So concretely, I identify two fears that Europeans have. First, that the US may undertake a very substantial withdrawal of its troops and assets in Europe, and that would leave a gap in European defenses. Why would there be a gap? Well, that's because of our dependency on the US, both in terms of combat power, but also for specific capabilities, the so-called enablers, the C2, the intelligence, for which we depend in a very pronounced way on the United States. And the second area of concern for Europeans is that the degree of ambiguity towards NATO, but also the degree of hostility, as you mentioned, in the relationship with Europe, is already undermining the deterrence. So that brings me to the question of what we are doing to adapt, what Europeans are doing to adapt. And I characterize our actions as a hedging strategy. So we are simultaneously addressing America's long-standing complaints about burden sharing to keep it engaged in Europe's defense. And at the same time, we are, by investing in our own security, advancing our own self-reliance. So to illustrate this in practice, what does it mean? Well, it means that first, Europeans have been spending more on defense. EU-wide spending in 2023 was at 1.6%. In 2025, it's supposed to hit 2.1% of GDP, and some member states are already well above that. And in any case, those that are members of NATO have pledged to spend 5% by 2035. The European Union is also contributing to the effort. We're all aware of the Rearm Europe plan, for example, or of the SAFE loan instrument to provide member states with long-term, low-interest loans. That's on the spending side. Then we have the intensification of cooperation within Europe. And I think this is perhaps an underappreciated side of the equation. What we're seeing is really an intensification of cooperation, both bilaterally between individual member states. And here I would single out, for example, Poland and France, but also France and the United Kingdom, with the summit this summer and the agreement to cooperate more closely in the nuclear domain, and also the bilateral treaty between Germany and the United Kingdom. And I'd also point to how small groups of countries are taking on an increasingly important role, whether in terms of dealing with Trump diplomatically and trying to steer him towards more constructive, aligned positions with the European ones in terms of the ceasefire in Ukraine, but also in driving support for Ukraine within so-called capability coalitions to provide Ukraine with specific pieces of equipment, and in the effort to ramp up Europe's own capacity through initiatives like the Sky Shield initiative or the Long-Range Strike Approach initiative. And another leg of this phenomenon is intensifying cooperation between the EU as an organization and non-EU European partners. Ukraine, above all, which is increasingly seen as part of Europe's security order, in particular when it comes to defense industrial issues, but also the UK, as I've mentioned. Where we're seeing, I think, a more nuanced picture is on the defense equipment question, because while it's clear that many Europeans are uncomfortable about the degree of reliance on US equipment, and the message at EU level is one of of wanting to foster greater self-reliance, the picture at the level of member states is less clear, in the sense that many have continued to place large orders from the US since at the beginning of Trump's second term. There have also been examples of high-profile examples of countries choosing not to purchase from the US, in particular Denmark's decision to buy SAMP-T anti-aircraft systems rather than the US Patriot. But it's a nuanced picture, and I think it illustrates the difficulties that Europeans will have in moving away from such a high degree of dependency on US kit. So the question is, where do we go from here? My argument is that the direction of travel overall is fairly clear. We're going to see an America that is less involved in European security and a Europe that is more self-reliant. How far we go along that road, at what speed, and what the process looks like is still rather hazy. There would be, in principle, scope for a new transatlantic defense bargain that would see Europeans assuming gradually more responsibility for their own security as the US steps back. That requires trust, which is in relatively short supply, as the paper sets out. In terms of recommendations, what should Europeans do to maximize the chance of that gradual transition being successful? My argument is that we have so far been in a mindset of tactical adaptation. We're preparing for a range of relatively benign scenarios where the US, yes, reduces its involvement, but remains relatively engaged in Europe. And that's a strategy that has risks. We should, in my view, shift to a mindset of more strategic adaptation that allows us to deal with a broader range of scenarios. And that would mean taking ownership of the transition in a much stronger way by sustaining higher defense spending, by further ramping up cooperation within Europe, and by investing in a degree of redundancy in case US assets are not available, which would mean investing comparatively more in filling those capability areas in which we depend, in particular, on the US. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Luigi. You've painted a complex picture indeed, because we know that on defense, Europe very much depends on the US, and there is in principle a way and an agreement on both sides of the Atlantic that Europe will step up. But as you said, the problem with low trust is that the degree of disengagement could be bigger, and Europe has to also take into account that possibility. Now, another area in which perhaps there's even more risk, not only of US disengagement, but of actual tension between the two sides of the Atlantic, is the area of countering disinformation, which has been at the center of European activities in recent years. As we know, it's one of the biggest weapons in the Russian assets and beyond. And right now, the US picture has changed. So for that, I will turn to Leonardo, who will tell us what the situation in the world of counter disinformation is.
Thanks, Giuseppe. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss this with all of you. As you said, countering disinformation is a policy field where the Trump administration's interests clearly diverge from those of Europe, and trust is at a minimum. Since its first days in office, this White House has taken a U-turn from the approach of the previous administration. This radical shift is impacting US policies at home, and it is now also spilling over into US foreign policy, with serious implications for Europe. The US is dismantling its own countering FIMI apparatus, while at the same time attacking those who try and block malign activities, such as the European Union, labeling them as enemies of free speech. Therefore, in this chapter, I describe this change of stance that has brought about both a retrenchment at home and disruption abroad. So domestically, we saw this retrenchment, or as someone described it, a total disarmament in the fight against Russian and Chinese disinformation, starting with the closure of the Countering Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Hub, the office that took over from the Global Engagement Center within the State Department. And let's be clear, these offices were closed on the grounds of allegedly restricting free speech for US citizens, even though they solely focused on foreign disinformation. For example, we know that they played a key role in exposing Russian, Chinese, and Iranian FIMI that was targeting the elections in 2024. We have also seen similar efforts of defunding in the FBI, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, and the Homeland Security Department. More recently, we witnessed the announcement of the closure of the National Intelligence Foreign Malign Influence Center. And clearly, these efforts are both motivated and accompanied by the effort to politicize the notion of free speech. And as we witnessed, this is also happening abroad. So on the international scene, we have seen Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference as a pivotal moment in the politicization of free speech against the European Union. As we know, it led to direct interference into member state elections in Germany, Romania, and Poland, most notably, and as well as serving as the basis to launch a campaign, a communications campaign against the DSA, so the Digital Services Act, the EU's social media regulation, and to regulate also very large online platforms, and also against the EU efforts of countering foreign interference. These were depicted as a scam to monetize US companies or a censorship by a global elite. Moreover, we witness cuts in the funding of media outlets like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, and most importantly, cuts to USAID budget, to media freedom and literacy project in countries of strategic importance for the European Union, like Georgia, Armenia, and the Western Balkans. And from the data that I collected for this chapter, we have seen that these USAID cuts will affect 65% of the total of projects being implemented in this region and countries for 2025. So there will be a very significant cut with repercussions for the Eastern neighborhood. These media outlets and projects clearly contributed to American soft power, while at the same time also advancing the EU's interest by countering authoritarian narratives and disinformation alike in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. So overall, and ultimately, this disengagement jeopardizes European interests and open up contested information spaces. And meanwhile, we know that Russia, only in 2025, is investing more than $1 billion in state-sponsored media, according to data from the European External Action Service. And at the same time, Chinese content is already filling these spaces, filling this vacuum, and literally the same airwaves and frequencies that were previously occupied by US media. And we saw this happening from Nigeria to Indonesia. So how should Europe respond? In the chapter, I draw 4 recommendations for Europe. The first is to still try engage with Washington, where it is still possible. So if it is unlikely to restore full trust and a value-based approach is bound to backfire, Europe should try to engage nonetheless on contested areas, in less contested areas, for example, focusing on Chinese disinformation, which tends to be perceived as less contested by Washington, or packaging disinformation and countering FIMI into broader policy dialogues, for example, on cybersecurity or hybrid threats. Secondly, the EU should continue to build and lead coalitions. The EU has proved to be a norm setter and a coalition builder in countering online disinformation. it should continue to do so, starting with the remaining G7 members, with which Europe has recently signed new security and defense partnerships, therefore the United Kingdom, Japan, and Canada, as well as partners in contested information spaces, starting from Africa and Latin America. Thirdly, the EU must secure Europe and the neighborhood. Therefore, EU and member states should continue to invest in FIMI defenses at home, while also trying to fill the gap that was left by USAID in the eastern neighborhood. Lastly, the EU should communicate more proactively. Washington's retrenchment has left traditional and social media spaces open for adversarial actors and authoritarian narratives by these actors. Therefore, the EU should try to fill the airwaves and social media spaces with positive messaging, and also by investing in a new digital diplomacy strategy. So I leave it here for now, and back to you, Giuseppe.
Many thanks, Leo. You brought us, again, an area that is quite complicated. It is quite essential for the EU, but it is an area in which we're basically not only witnessing an enormous gap in the US support, but also potential clashes. That's quite important. And speaking of gaps, we want to move now to regions of the world that have seen similar situations as Europe or have experienced a different framework in engaging with Trump too. And I think that your mentioning of the cuts to USAID funding is a good bridge to the region of the Western Balkans, where a lot of projects were funded by that organization, but also more generally, the American presence is so central. And even small changes and small withdrawals can cause major impacts. So the Western Balkans is obviously very important to Europe. So I want to pass it on to Bojana, who will tell us how that region is experiencing the second Trump administration.
Thank you, Giuseppe, and it's a pleasure to do this with other colleagues. While listening to Luigi, but also to Leonardo, and also knowing what other people wrote that are not today here, I actually came to a conclusion that across different theaters and irrespectively of whether it's about regions or domains, we can already discern similar patterns of strategic disengagement, where basically great power, competition, and internal preoccupations limit sustained attention. And as you rightly pointed out, this was also, or it is true for the Western Balkans. So in that case, there are 3 points that I would like to bring forward. First and foremost, the region is not a priority for Washington. There is currently no clear nor coherent US policy direction for the region, and this creates a vacuum of strategic leadership. And one clear sign of this waning American interest is the delay, for instance, in ambassadorial nominations or appointments, where we see that only Montenegro and North Macedonia have career ambassador in post since 2018 and 2022, respectively. And there was a recent attempt by President Trump to nominate ambassador to Serbia, but it was withdrawn with no official reasons disclosed. The second point is the question remains whether this disengagement is actually better than counterproductive engagement against the EU's interests in the region. And this question emerges as the main question in my chapter, because with democracy under strain in the US, but also globally, as well as media freedom shrinking, development aid, as you mentioned, shrinking, the status quo may be less harmful than a more active form of engagement that inadvertently strengthens illiberal forces and basically turns the Western Balkans into collateral damage. And the third point is about strategic uncertainty that we already heard from colleagues. It's about uncertainty in EU-US relations that leaves the region exposed. This degree of ambiguity, the growing disconnect between the EU and the US puts a core assumption when it comes to the Western Balkans to the test, that the US will remain a reliable, proactive partner in supporting regional stability and EU enlargement. And this assumption, rooted in decades of transatlantic alignment, is under increasing strain. So what we have been seeing in the past 10 months in the region is the downgrade in diplomatic energy, rather than a shift in core policy, I would say, but this is at least for now. This means that American presence, partnerships, and pressure can no longer be taken for granted. And let me just give you one example of the 2024 and 2025 UN Security Council statements that basically illustrate this downgrade. Both statements reaffirmed Washington's commitment to peace and stability in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but the 2024 statement was assertive, detailed, politically sharp. It included strong backing for the Office of High Representative, framed its role as complementary to the EU integration process, whereas the 2025 statement was more technocratic. It maintained the formal position on the Dayton Peace Accords, but avoided politically charged issues like Srebrenica, and also offered only general acknowledgement of the OHR's role. And similar technocratic rhetoric was also evident in subsequent speeches, such as the one that was delivered by Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau at the 2025 NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So what does this mean for the EU? One thing that we need to remember is that the Western Balkans is the region where the EU can actually make a difference. So this current situation should not be seen only as a risk, but as a strategic opening, because it does offer the EU a chance to recalibrate its approach to assume greater leadership in the region and reinforce its strategic credibility. And this particularly concerns 3 points. First is EU4 Althea mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where strengthening Europe's own abilities to operate now make more sense than ever. And preparing now for any surprises in the future is a prudent step for keeping the tensions in the region low. Second, as in other regions and policy areas, some of which my colleagues have already touched upon, we need to keep communication channels open and identify areas where the EU and US interests converge. And there, I believe the EU could make an economic argument apart from a security one. That is obvious. And this is that reversing a 30-year record of US involvement could harm actually American business interests, particularly in markets like Albania and Serbia, which had already attracted attention from circles close to President Trump. And if we look at the numbers in the EU, we'll see that the US exports to the EU support 2.3 million American jobs, while EU's investments in the US create 3.4 million jobs. So the enlargement as well should be also in America's interest. And the final related to that point, and this is a non-negotiable one, is that security cannot come at the expense of democracy, because without democracy, there can be no lasting stability or security in the region. And at a time when American engagement is faltering, the EU must resist any temptation to trade democratic conditionality for short-term stability. And this should be actually the red line that will hopefully guide any future engagement with this region. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bojana. And you made a lot of very interesting points, including, at the end, you were sort of alluding to the idea of transactionalism, which seems to be another of the things that at least are part of the world of Trump as a businessman, and they have translated into some degree of his foreign policy, and to what extent the EU should or should not pick up from the same playbook. You seem to suggest not, and it's a good thing. But now, I think that the problem of transactionalism is real in other regions of the world, for instance, the Middle East, and more specifically, the Gulf. Now, that is a region that is particularly interesting in the way it has dealt with Trump too. And one of the points made in that chapter is that some of these features may have been seen coming for a while. But I don't want to say anything else about it. I want to give the floor to the expert, Kasia, Katarina, who can tell us what exactly is going on in that region and how they have dealt with the new US presidency. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Giuseppe. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you and all the colleagues discussing the Shio paper. So as you said, the Gulf region is specific when it comes how it's experiencing the current Trump 2.0 presidency, because what I argue in the chapter is that unlike many other regions of the world, including Europe, the Gulf leaders were really not taken by surprise by how the US is approaching policymaking. And my argument is that the trust between the Gulf and the US hasn't really broken, but it's been eroding over time and over the past 4 administrations, really. And the overall message that we're getting here is that for the Gulf states, and I've been understanding this for quite a while, is that US is not a bulletproof security guarantor, but there's no real alternative to US as a security guarantor. So with that, they've been really employing a lot of strategies. They've been hedging, they've been trying to form other alliances while at the same time working closely with the US. And the breaking point that really kind of brought a reckoning to the region regarding relationship with the US was in 2019, when the Gulf oil, Saudi oil facilities were attacked, allegedly by forced link to Iran, and the US did not respond. So that really was a moment when the Gulf leaders understood that the assumption that if they are attacked, the US will come to the rescue is not necessarily the one on which they can build their future. And that had multiple spillovers, better, worse. One of the positive ones, I would argue, is that instead of forcing kind of a more forceful approach towards Iran, so opposing the 2015 JCPOA, for instance, is a good example of that. The Gulf leaders starting approaching Iran and kind of forming more diplomatic relationship, trying to approach kind of a diplomatic closure with Iran, understanding that in the medium to long run, actually, it's in the better interest to try to calm things down with Iran than to rely on US being able to defend them from Iran. Now, the last couple of months or a couple of weeks really kind of showed us and really zoomed in on this dilemma of the Gulf states. So first we had the so-called 12-day war between Israel and Iran, during which, of course, Qatar was attacked by the Iranians. And then the September Israeli attack on Qatar as well, where, I mean, it's really still not very clear whether the US knew about it well in advance or whether it really learned about it last minute. But the fact is that the US did not manage to stop Israel from striking Qatar. And then what the Gulf states did was obviously respond with more hedging. So the most prominent example of that was Saudi signing promptly a defense pact with Pakistan, signaling that it has other options. And it doesn't have to 100% always rely on the US. But at the same time, we are already hearing about resumptions of talk about security pact with the US as well. Similarly, Qatar at first threatened to step out from its mediating role in the Gaza peace talks because of the attack, but then promptly managed to, behind the scenes, secure Trump signing an executive order that guarantees security of Qatar. And why does it all matter is that it's almost like the Gulf region is kind of this laboratory where you can see how this very transactional approach of the current US administration is playing out, and how the Gulf leaders are actually employing transactional approach as well in order to navigate this current geopolitical reality. And that, of course, has a lot of implications, and it matters a lot for the EU, both because we can learn some things from the Gulf states in terms of how they've been dealing with Trump. We can't maybe buy Trump, planes, but we can do is understand that in order to deal with this administration, you have to hedge. You really have to hedge more strategically. You have to work with different. This is a long-term thing, but really work with different center of powers in the US to build your network in Washington and beyond. And also to learn from the Gulf states how to position yourself. Bojana mentioned, how important the EU's economy is. And it is really crucial to remind Trump and position the EU as a strong economic partner to show how many benefits there are from being engaged with the EU. That's what the Gulf states have been doing, in particular when positioning themselves as the one that are strongly supporting US economy with investments, with financial flows, as opposed to, for instance, Israel, which they're trying to position as a country that is draining the US resources by being continuously awarded military aid and dragging US into those forever wars that President Trump promised to withdraw from. Now, another thing that the EU can take out from the Gulf approach is towards the US and the broader situation is that the EU can really position itself, and it is doing it to some extent already, as this trustworthy, stable partner. Perhaps not the one with the most leverage, but the one that can be relied upon. And we see it in behind the scenes, for instance, of the talks for the Gaza ceasefire. We saw it in behind the scenes to some extent with Iran, where, again, the EU doesn't have the biggest leverage, but it is considered a partner that's stable, reliable, and that other partners can come to have a more stable and reasonable conversation. I will leave here. So back to you, Giuseppe, and I look forward to the discussion now with hopefully some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Kasia. And again, a fantastic conversation in which we see how it is not black and white. Each region has its own way of managing Trump, but certainly everyone is dealing with a serious set of problems. Now, we have about 35 minutes now that we can start discussing questions that come from the audience and sort of bring the conversation. Also, perhaps to touch upon other chapters. As a reminder, we have also chapters that deal with the role of the US in continued support of Ukraine and what Europe can do in picking up the slack, let's say, and do it more and taking more of the responsibility. We have chapters on the transatlantic policy on China, on big tech, on climate issues, where it's another area of big tension, but also other regions of the world, such as the Americas, the sub-Saharan Africa, and Northeast Asia. So, to start the conversation, let's start from one question that emerged from the chat, which asks specifically about defense spending and investment on US weapons. The question is the 5% spending a realistic goal? And if it is, will the European equipment replace US equipment, or will it affect US dependency substantially on US equipment? Generally, this is a question indeed about defense spending and sort of the trade-off of spending European versus spending American, which is something that, of course, in Europe, it's at the center of the conversation and a lot of EU initiatives in these days. But it is also a broader issue of dependencies. The EU and other countries of the world depend on the US for a variety of things. Now they've seen this dependency so far, not in negative terms, but in positive terms, a signal of continued US commitment. But across the world now, the question is emerging about whether this is also a source of vulnerability that may, for instance, hinder the ability of certain countries, such as the European countries, to develop the inability to defend themselves in case of a US disengagement. And that can be expanded to other regions of the world. But to start off, I think the question was directed very much to Luigi, so I will let him first take the word.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and it has several parts. So I would say first, is the 5% realistic? Well, it's important to remember that there are two components to it. First, there's a 3.5% on core defense spending, and then a 1.5% on security-related spending. And on those metrics, actually, some member states are either already there or not far from it. Of course, we know that politically the salience of defense spending varies across the European Union, so it's not necessarily going to be an easy sell all over. But I think the circumstances demand it. The time frame is also not a particularly short one. So I'm quite confident that the bulk of Europe will reach something approaching that level. When it comes to the question of replacing US equipment, I mean, I would say the real challenge is not so much that of replacing US equipment, but rather of reducing dependency. And there are two elements to that. The first element is dependency on US capabilities. So US command and control, US intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, for which we mainly depend on US capabilities and US equipment simultaneously. But in principle, that dependency could be reduced by buying US capabilities. So we could buy US capabilities of our own and therefore replace that specific dependency. And some countries within Europe may well choose that avenue. Then there is the broader discussion about building up Europe's own defense capabilities, defense production capacity, and reducing dependence on US supplied equipment that may well belong to Europeans already. And that is a question that is, at the political level, as I mentioned, a salient one. There is within the EU, there are a range of instruments designed to foster greater European production capacity and indeed to help Europeans develop weapons systems for which they may currently depend on the United States. And the reasons really are two. On one hand, so that we can have defense equipment that we fully control and for which we do not depend on external export restrictions or controls of use, that Europeans can therefore do what they wish with. And on the second dimension is that it is also a way of hedging against potential disruptions in supply within the US defense industrial base, which so far has been extremely reliable, but we are seeing signs of strain, not least because the US is trying to ramp up its own defense capabilities. And we know that in case of a conflict, say in East Asia, that production will be rerouted there. So it's another way of building up resilience. But to conclude, will we really see something, a full replacement of US capabilities in Europe or Europeans transitioning away from US equipment in a major way? I doubt it. I think there's going to be nuances with Europeans slowly building up their own capabilities and looking ahead by 5 years. We're going to be having more of these enablers for which we currently depend on the US and having more production capacity in Europe. But it's going to be a nuanced picture.
Thank you, Luigi. Indeed, nuanced picture, and but something that will remain at the center of discussions of European foreign policy and defense in the future. Now, since the discussion indeed is also about general dependencies, I would like to discuss about other dependencies that exist. For instance, there are dependencies on energy, and that is a good area in which we can bring back Bojana and asking how that region of the world has been dealing with this kind of reliance on the US.
Sure, and here I can offer a concrete example because just recently the US sanctioned Serbian oil industry, which is a big thing because in a way it does not play into the argument that the US acts against the EU interests, because it's also in the EU interest to reduce Russian dependency. And we know that the majority stakeholder in Serbian oil industry are actually Russian. So one of the main aims of sanctions was to prevent the financing of Russia's war against Ukraine through revenues generated by Russian energy companies. And Russian energy companies are also, of course, present in other countries, notably Bosnia and Herzegovina and its entity Republika Srpska. So basically, the implementation of the sanctions that were introduced in January, they had previously been postponed 8 times, and it was very unknown whether they will take effect or not. But on 9 December, they did. And what's in it for the US? Well, although there are announcements of the strategic dialogue and the rapprochement between Serbia and the US. It was clear from the very beginning that actually sanctions against oil industry were inevitable. And the White House, on the one hand, wanted to significantly reduce Russia's presence in Serbia's energy market, which, as I mentioned, aligns with the EU interests, as Russia holds a monopoly there. But on the other hand, it actually wants to fill that gap with imports of American LNG. And this only reinforces the statement that, Giuseppe, you also previously mentioned, that it's also very transactional. It's about business transactions. And it also brings me to the conclusion that while US foreign policy today is primarily guided by its own strategic and economic interests, and while these interests may occasionally align with the national priorities of specific partner countries, at times with the EU, they often result in transactional rather than long-term cooperative engagement. So the question actually still, when it comes to energy, remains: how are we still going to reduce the dependency on the US while effectively reducing the dependency on Russia, which is also one of the EU's goals?
Very good, Boyan. And indeed, this is, I think what you made, the point that you made is also relatable to other chapters that are covered, more specifically the fact that we don't know sometimes which US policy is going to stick and which one is going to change again in a very short while. And we think that the recent series of events resulting in the first suggestion, then potential cancellation of a Budapest summit between Trump and Putin have once again increased questions in Europe about which is exactly Trump's own position. And the answer that we provide in the group is that this is also in the paper, is that it is not, it is a difficult thing to try to understand what exactly Trump wants in the long run, but or even more difficultly, how we will try to achieve certain objectives. And this, for Europe, is probably best to take a longer term approach rather than simply react to every single change in the White House in terms of communication and so on. Now, we've had another set of questions that relates generally to European ability to develop an independent foreign policy and also engaging with the White House. One is a general question about becoming more independent from US when it comes to developing its own foreign policy and path forward. And there's another question about how to deal with Trump, whether in a very tactical sense, as you know, borrowing one of the terms that was used today, but also included in the research that we did, basically trying to appease the White House and be shown on the same side. But at the same time, this may risk having consequences in the long run for some of the EU's interests. Now, I would say we will start with the examples from the Middle East and the Gulf. Kasia can touch upon that, and then I will ask some other colleagues whether they are able to discuss the question of capabilities and independence. Kasia.
Right, thank you, Giuseppe. I think the case of the Middle East is particularly enlightening when it comes to the capacity of the EU to decouple its foreign policy from the US. So in the immediate term, we see that really the US is running the show with the Gaza ceasefire. It's really the Trump and his kind of personal involvement that brought us where we are. And the EU was not really involved very much in the process. Trump officially didn't even mention that the EU should be, whether it's going to be on this board of peace that is envisioned. Different member states has played a bigger or smaller roles, but overall the EU was not part of the package. But at the same time, like I hinted on before, some partners reached out to the EU behind the scenes to broadly support the process and to continue supporting the process in various ways, not just by financially propping the Palestinian Authority. And what it tells me is that when it comes to foreign policy, the EU really has to have this kind of double two-way approach. And one is that on big items issues, I mean, everyone has to be behind the Gaza peace deal because there's no other deal in place. But at the same time, we need to be strategic about what our interests and our values are, and working behind the scenes, try to bring those into the whatever deals or pacts are being done by Trump in the Middle East. For many, many years, the EU was kind of seen as a package together with the US as the West throughout the region, for a variety of reasons. Now there's actually I argue that this is a chance for the EU to kind of in the strategic way decouple. We have this new pact for the Mediterranean. We're talking about kind of different various EU's initiative to think long term. This is something that Trump administration doesn't seem to be doing. It's all about like those short term immediate solution. So what the EU can do is to think more in the long term how to shape its policy, while at the same time realizing that again its leverage is quite limited throughout the region. And I think it links quite well to the question about that someone posed about how to approach Trump in terms of flattering or pacifying him. It appears that's what everyone has been doing, really. And I think that's the way to approach Trump, to in public really flatter him and try to be as appealing as you might be, and to talk about more kind of difficult things behind the scenes when the cameras are not on. Trump doesn't seem to respond very well to people taking harder stance towards him in public. While it does seem that some behind the scenes conversations on more difficult topics are paying off. I will give you an example. We of course know how unfortunate was the meeting between President Zelensky and Trump, where President Zelensky tried to be a little bit more assertive, didn't really play out well. At the same time, coming back to the region, Qatar, in public, they really went to a very long way to make sure that after Israel invaded Qatar, and of course they were furious, but not to make it about the US and not to put any blame on the US in public. Always stressing that the US is a great friend of Qatar, that President Trump personally is a great friend. He's been trying to help Qatar and so on. But at the same time, behind the scenes, there was a lot of work and hard conversation happening that led to actually President Trump signing the executive order. And that also led to President Trump making Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu making this phone call apologizing to the Qataris. So I think overall that's the way to approach it. I don't think you can gain very much from publicly criticizing Trump, especially into his face.
Thank you, Cassia. And as you're talking about how to flatter the president and so on, there's actually a paradox right now that each country is indeed trying to be on Trump's side or pretend or show to be in Trump's side. Clearly, that's tactically a good approach. But at the same time, the risk is for the first one, basically the challenges and the cost for the first one to defect from that policy of support for the White House may be very, very big, because they will be the one at the center of all the reaction from the White House. So that is the risk in speaking more assertively. But at the same time, what you were pointing out is that we also need, on the one hand, tactical approaches, but we do need the capability development. And that was already mentioned by Luigi, but I wanted to also touch on Leonardo, because he talked about the EU needing to work on its own on fighting disinformation. And the question is, do you think this is something that is reachable within the short term?
Yeah, thanks for the questions. So if we want to talk about dependency, going back to what was mentioned and what you mentioned, I think that the EU has the capacity and the potential leadership to go about countering disinformation alone, but it should do so with others. Meaning that if we look at the data that I mentioned before, that I have here in front of me, we see how USAID cuts represent the 65% of the funds for those projects on media literacy in the European closest eastern neighborhood. But following USAID, we have funds from the EU Commission, several member states, the UK, Canada, the United Nations. Therefore, if Europe is certainly facing this fight against disinformation now without a resourceful ally and all of the funds that US was ready and capable mobilizing. I think that a new approach, a new response on the European side should be guided by two principles that are also mentioned at in the closing chapter of this Shio paper, that are pragmatism and partnership. Therefore, in the way of pragmatism, trying to pool of these efforts, all of these different funding, these different projects together in a more coordinated manner with all of these like-minded partners, as said, starting with UK and Canada and the rest of the G7. And one recent example of fighting disinformation with a renewed security and defense partnership is what is happening on the increased coordination with London, so with the United Kingdom, on sanctioning Russian actors that are funding and carrying on these disinformation campaigns in Britain as well as in Europe. So I think that this new approach based on renewed partnership can work, is working, and more coordination can be certainly achieved. Thanks.
Excellent. And of course, this is essential because those threats basically are coming all the time. We know that any elections right now is an opportunity for malign interference in the European neighborhood as well as inside the EU. So this is not going to disappear anytime soon. Now, we just received additional question on the US pressuring other parts of the world. And basically, the example here is about the Global Combat Air Program between the UK, Italy, and Japan, and that creates uncertainties in the US as well about allies developing capabilities. And then the question is, how can the Europeans and their non-European allies continue forward in the development of projects that reduce dependency on the US while at the same time preserving their defense policy cooperation with the US? I think this is a very broad question, and I think is a good note on which to pose the last question. So I would give each of you 1 minute to sort of answer this key question on preserving capabilities on the one, preserving the relationship with the US on the one hand, and developing sort of capabilities in Europe as well as dealing with partners. I know if you could, in short sentence, try to see what is the way forward in this. I know it's a difficult question, but in each of your areas, how you could summarize the main way forward. Maybe we started in the order. We start with Luigi, who hasn't spoken for a while, and then I pass it on to the others.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And I think it goes back to many of the points that we've already made. So in terms of preserving cooperation, I would pick up some of the points about the communication style, about maintaining a constructive relationship, about being very cognizant of the cards we hold, which are not especially strong cards right now. And so living within that reality and hedging, but also not giving up on what's important to us, namely, if there are projects in which we have already invested a lot of time and effort and which have a high chance of paying off, and in the case of the UK, Italy, and Japan, that may be GCAP, then these should be red lines for us, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to be pressured. So it's that I would actually summarize under the note of pragmatism, of being very aware of where we stand, and hopefully that is a good answer.
Excellent. Yeah. Bojana, how do we do this with our Western Balkan partners?
I already touched upon it in my intervention, the first one, and it's about defining the red lines. And I presume that first and foremost, the most important is not to favor security over democracy. The EU, but also with its partners, should continue working in parallel on ensuring the safe and secure environment in the region while working on improving the democratic conditions in all of these countries. And one of the ways to do that is through the enlargement framework. And then, of course, when it comes to other industries such as defense and security, which is on the top of the European agenda, we do know that the Western Balkans have a lot to offer in terms of production of arms and missiles, but also industry-wise, strategic mobility, etc. But there are already some initiatives that are ongoing, both with the EU member states and with other European partners, such as the UK. And I just believe that we should continue moving into that direction. I'm very much in favor of delineating the red lines, because there is certain extent to which we can go in order not to jeopardize what the European Union as a project is. And I think it really needs to be clear and made clear to our partners, including across the Atlantic.
Thank you, Bojana. Kasia, any last words that you would like to add?
Yeah, I would probably echo what Luigi said about being pragmatic, and I would just also call it perhaps being smart about it. So like I said, for instance, when it comes to the Gaza ceasefire, the Trump plan, I mean, whether we like exactly how it's shaped doesn't really matter, right? We are where we are. So what you can do right now is to work behind the scenes. So again, be smart about it, perhaps not always, being super publicly loud about certain fields of cooperation where the US might not be very keen on, for instance, securing the UN Security Council mandate for any security force going into Palestinian territories, but working with the partners that are interested behind the scene, kind of building the momentum and building the critical mass that is needed to slowly and smartly push forward with certain policies that President Trump might not be very, very happy about, especially at first.
Excellent. Well, let's say that we are now at the hour, so I want to thank all the participants who joined our event, and of course our 4 colleagues who have joined us and explained their view of the US-EU relationship, or the relationship with another group of countries. This is just but a little piece of a much bigger puzzle, of course, for Europe, and of a much bigger research project that we have carried out. There are many more chapters, and we will do other events, including in Brussels. If you are around, please join our events for the presentation of that your paper. And generally, if you are interested in this difficult question of tactical versus strategic approaches to the new Trump administration, and generally how the transatlantic relationship will move forward under Trump 2.0 and beyond, make sure to take a look at our Shayo paper, and from the introduction to the conclusion to the many chapters in between. And with that, thank you for your attention, and we very much look forward to our future engagement as the EOSS with all of you. Thank you very much, and have a lovely rest of the day.